Even though I primarily grew up with the PlayStation 2, today I find myself enamored with its predecessors' 3D platformers, RPGs, action, and fighting games. Even though I still find many of these games to be great today, it feels like you can't go a minute on the internet without someone complaining about how a game has aged poorly, which is a bit of a loaded thing to say considering games don't physically go the way of milk unless you factor in disk run. 3D was the new hotness at the time, and while many were excited, people were still figuring everything out, obviously leading to mixed results in retrospect. Even if some of these games indicate the world might have not been ready for the polygonal space, it is certainly what Sony of America pushed for on the console, with the then executive VP Bernie Stolar apparently having an anti-2D and anti-RPG policy early in the console lifecycle. This may have been done to the console's later release in the US, coming mere months before the public unveiling the technically superior Nintendo 64 to show its 3D superiority over that of the earlier released Saturn and definitely FX chip Super Nintendo games, or to simply not be behind the time to Americans which may have just generally preferred 3D games. But regardless, this led to 2D games being relatively few and far between on the console when compared to other regions. Sure, we still received excellent 2D games that made the most of the console's 2D abilities, like Rayman, Mega Man, Castlevania, Symphony of the Man, but we missed out on quite a few wonderful games that graced Japanese game store shelves. I'm not saying that this is the only reason that these games didn't come here, as I'm sure investors thought games like Policenauts and Tokimeki Memorial would have unfortunately cost way more to localize than they would have recouped here. And anime in general was not as popular in 1995 as it is in the West now, whether you're talking about the art style or your various licenses. Still, many of these games are still worth your time, whether you speak Japanese or not, and make a great addition to your the digital collection.
As you can see, this is a PlayStation Black Disc. Cut number 1 contains computer data, so please don't play it. But you probably won't listen to me anyway, will you?
So I'm going to start off with a bit of a cheat here to begin with. The first game was actually released in Europe in addition to Japan, but looking at the price it goes for now in that region, it might as well not have. Regardless, it didn't come to the US, so I feel justified talking about it here as an Americentric piece of trash. Gunner's Heaven, known as Rapid Reload in some other regions, is a 2D running gun that wears its influence on its sleeve, even down to its name. Without beating around the bush, Gunner's Heaven does seem similar to Gunstar Heroes, to the point that some called it a clone even at that time. Both games have you, one of two gun people, mowing down hordes of baddies with very unique guns, some light platforming, and even throws at close range. Both games' initials are even GH for God's sake. Instead of the combination system found in Gunstar, Gunners instead has 4 guns you can switch between at any time: a machine gun, homing shot, a multi-shot, and a flamethrower, which all feel completely different and, when feeding off the power meter, have far more destructive capabilities. The two characters, Axel and Ruka, also have their unique variations of the weapons. They're also fitted with grappling hooks to quickly get around the screen and to higher platforms, which gives it all a certain bionic commando energy. Each stage has difficult bosses whose patterns you'll likely need to memorize, not to mention the mobs between them. Thankfully, you have infinite continues in the Japanese version at least, not in the European one, so play that one. And there are checkpoints after every boss as well, but the lack of an option to co-op blast them up with a friend does feel sorely missed. The game looks and sounds great for a 1995 2D game, but pales in comparison in the run-and-gun world to the next year's Metal Slug. Therein seems to be the problem preventing it from coming to America. It was localized to come to Europe at the console's launch, seemingly by Sony of Europe, but Sony of America probably didn't want to put out a 100% 2D pixel game that may have seemed closer to an upgraded-looking Genesis game than something you buy next-gen console for. Sure, it's probably aged better than the low-poly fest of Battle Arena Toshinden, but it's not wildly different from the game that inspired it. It may not reach the heights or have the legacy in games of Treasure's debuts and even some of its later games, but it proved a good sophomore effort for Mediavision, whose name you may not recognize today, but have proved invaluable in the JRPG space, having worked on games in the Valkyria Chronicles, Shining, and Digimon series recently, as well as creating the Wild West means Industrial Revolution of the Wild Arms series. Gunner's Heaven shows little what the company would go on to do in the JRPG space, arguably even less than the studio's debut space RPG dungeon crawler Crime Crackers, which I'm not talking about here since there's way too much text. But Gunner's Heaven is an entertaining side-scrolling shooter, well worth your time and hard drive space. If you prefer your platformers to be methodical and thinky rather than twitchy and shooty, the Umihara Kawase series might be more up your alley. The first game was released on the Super Famicom by the little-known TNN, whose name is apparently derived from Think About Needs of Notice for Human Being. According to Moby Games, which doesn't list a source for this, TNN also put out a mediocre soccer game before being bought out and renaming to the Jackpot Company, who then released a sequel for the PlayStation, Shun, literally meaning in season, which years later would get re-released on a budget line as Second Edition, with advertising for the fishing company Mitchell present in cutscenes in Shun removed and replaced with cute character art and extra stages. Both games follow a simple story of the eponymous character, Umihara Kawase, whose name comes from the saying, "Sea fish are fat in the belly, river fish are fat in the back," in Japanese of course, not in English. She's a young sushi chef in a strange world full of large fish, and she's armed with a hammer-space backpack, a fishing rod, and an elastic line. Both games follow a similar formula, a simple level-based format in which Umi must reach the end of a stage, or as they're called here, fields. The main gimmick, though, is the ability to use your tools as a retractable grappling hook of sorts, which can be used to capture enemies, latch onto distant platforms and reel herself in, swing over gaps, attach to conveyor belts, or gain momentum for a jump, among other ways of manipulating the physics here. As with many platformers with a focus on movement, it's hard to describe how the game actually feels, but Umi and her various modes of movement have a surprising heft, allowing for a wonderful feeling of momentum if a jump is made properly, and contains many advanced techniques I could not imagine mastering to cheat oneself through a level quickly. There are alternate paths too, allowing for skipping a few levels if trickier jumps are made too. The original game has something of a cheap look, with most platforms being plain checkered boxes and voids that could fit in just about any game, but Shun adds literal depth, which gives a great deal of charm. The perspective does help levels feel bigger and less plain while retaining that dreamlike absurdity, whereas many sprites now have this watercolor-like detail which elevates it above the original graphics of the Super Famicom game for me. Both the original and Shun are great slow-paced platformers to just vibe with, but Shun, specifically the adless version, though there is a charm to the voiceover ads of the original, vibes harder, which matters more for a slow-paced game like this. After a poorly received remake for the PSP and a better received one for the DS that brought back the original designer to oversee it, the cult status of the series was cemented, and many of the original staff returned for a third game of the series, Sayonara, which saw the game come to Western shores for the first time. Thankfully, the series lives on to this day in various forms, namely with ports of the original, Shun and Sayonara to the PC, making this one the one game I'm talking about here that's legally playable on a console newer than the PS3. May the bouncy fishing rod live on. A large Dragon Quest-like man with a sword, Ralph, not little here, stands up to an invading army of monsters before magic makes him fit the title of the game, A Quite Defenseless Little Ralph. As this is a video game after all, his girlfriend or whomever is kidnapped. After a pep talk from his magical sword, being given clothes by some helpful townsfolk, the titular Little Ralph begins on his also titular adventure to reclaim his height and girl. No short kings allowed in this game. He is armed with his sword, a fairy thing which acts as a shield, and most importantly, infinite continues. And you're going to need this, as this is a big ol' hard platformer that would have felt right at home as a late Sega CD or Super Famicom release, but instead released in 1999 on the PlayStation. From what info I could find online, it seems to have started production on the Sharp X68000 in the early 90s, but was seemingly stuck in dev heck for a better part of a decade by New Corporation's desire to make what they envisioned as a culmination of late 80s platformers gameplay-wise, but with some of the best 2D pixel art you can get and some astounding music. It plays like a natural evolution of something like Castlevania, Wonder Boy, and other Famicom and Mega Drive action platformers, where you proceed linearly through levels by jumping around obstacles and hitting enemies with your sword. Along your way, you can collect temporary sword power-ups that extend to range or shoot fireballs, get a shield to bring back your fairy thing to take another hit for you. This probably wasn't taken from Spyro, by the way, in case you were wondering. Hearts to get more lives, fruits for points, and whatever this little ice climber's guy is. Your jump has the right level of control to it to feel satisfying, but still requiring quite a bit of precision, and the varied enemies are fun to face off due to their designs and a great sword swing with an even better hitbox to it. The sword can be charged and released like a baseball bat to send an enemy flying, often bowling down a line of foes for extra points or reaching otherwise unreachable objects. The main draw, though, might just be the level design. Most stages have optimal paths you can take which are rewarding, not just in power-ups or points you receive, but from pulling off the extra tricky platforming as well. Like Sonic, there are often multiple layers in a stage, with the top path being more difficult to maintain upon with precise platforming, but contains extra rewards. In each level you'll see fruit appear, and their main purpose is just for points, though collecting all in a row might just make a heart appear as well. But they disappear quickly as well to both guide optimal movement and to keep the player moving. Filling up the hearts fraction on the screen gives you an extra life, as does passing a point threshold. Each stage has logical transitions, also kind of like Sonic 3, which adds a nice level of credibility and place to the world. Each level has a distinct theme, starting with the city, with minimal obstacles except people throwing pots out of windows, and eventually moving through sewers and ruins on Ralph's little quest, with unique enemies beautifully detailed by immaculate pixel art with minimal to no 3D effects in most given areas, and fun unique bosses that are challenging yet fair thanks to generous checkpointing even after having to continue. Later in the game, Ralph gets enough power to become big again for short periods of time to defeat bosses, turning the battle into a single-button fighting game, complete with motion inputs. While it's a little stiff and somewhat simple, it's reasonable considering how sparingly it's used. What it does instill is a feeling of epicness, becoming even for a mano-a-mano duel with a powerful enemy, rather than the David versus Goliath of the other bosses. Everything here adds up to something that feels certainly dated, even in its time, but not bad at all. This very traditional game takes many of the best things from its influences and comes out as an excellent send-up to arcade action platformers of the time, even down to the game's extensive score, which seems to take cues from pre-Windows Japanese home computer games and early CD-based games. It's an absolute treat to listen to, and I'd highly recommend that if nothing else. Due to its charmingly archaic-looking gameplay, lack of prestige of its developers, and late release date of 1999 coming not far ahead of the PlayStation 2 and well behind the popularization of 3D platformers on the console, it's little wonder why Little Ralph couldn't venture west. Which is unfortunate, besides being a good game, as this has become something of a holy grail in the PlayStation import collecting community that I can only one day dream of owning. Thankfully, digital ownership and collecting is far easier, and if you like 2D platformers with a focus on quick combat and solid design behind a great presentation, this is something worth checking out at that much lower price point. One genre that always seemed to be a bit more popular in Japan than in the US was scrolling shooters. Doesn't help that many well-regarded ones originate from consoles that barely sold here, on PCs that didn't sell at all here, or simply didn't have the monetary backing to risk a global launch. Like Little Ralph, Gaia Seed was made by a small startup company that released very little outside Japan and stopped putting out console games near the turn of the millennium. Techno Soleil seems to still exist today from what I can tell, though making literal crap software. Also, like Little Ralph, the soundtrack absolutely rips. The game is a horizontal-oriented shooter akin to Gradius or Darius, but sets itself apart due to its relative simplicity, being that there's only 2 upgradable weapons and 2 also upgradable sub-weapons. Bosses where you win if you endure until the time hits 0, and a regenerating shield. The shield is easily the most impactful mechanic, not only that it beat Halo to the punch by 5 years, but makes for a slightly easier game in a difficult genre. Sure, the shield recovers slowly, but not going down in one hit is a grace often not afforded in the likes of other spacey space shooty shoots. On whatever Google translates from the company's website, it seems that it was designed to be a game that beginners could play. Though, I find the ship to play a bit slowly and just a bit larger than I like, with the lack of variety in weapons not leading to a great replayability factor. What I do like, besides the music of course, is the cross-dimensional setting inside of a fake planet, from what I can tell, complete with smooth level transitions without loading screens. The graphics seem to act almost as an extension of Super Famicom games, using the enhanced power of the PlayStation to recreate something that looks more like Mode 7 and other rotational effects rather than throwing the 5 polygons a PlayStation could render at a screen. Overall, Gaia Seed is a solid horizontal scrolling space shooter that's certainly not worth the price it's going for, but easily worth the going rate on old PSN or some internet archive. While Gaia Seed may have been fairly standard in the genre, Harmful Park might be best known for being anything but. As something more of a cute-em-up, a genre spearheaded by the likes of Twinbee and Cotton, which never really gained traction outside of Japan. Instead of the common sci-fi, real-life war, and even the occasional medieval or Wild West settings found in many scrolling shooters, cute-em-ups opt for, well, cute and whimsical designs with a healthy sense of humor. Twinbee and Fantasy Zone use cartoonish designs for ships and enemies, often with features of living beings that wouldn't feel out of place in early Disney, and feature bright and colorful settings to blow up. Games like Cotton and Magical Chase use anime-style young witches to elicit an air of playfulness. Even the freaking skeletons are cute, almost belying the often brutal difficulty of the games themselves. Most relevant here, probably, is Konami's Parodius series, which exists as a humorous and surreal parallel to their own Gradius game, starring a good flying octopus boy and friends as they fight through increasingly bizarre locales. Harmful Park is a similarly playing side-scrolling shooter featuring 2 women in flying machines traveling through a theme park turned flying secret base to stop the evil Dr. Tequila. Enemies are everything from berserk Ferris wheels to evil stuffed animals. Weapons are various confections and desserts, switched between on the fly, and each represent a different type of attack in other shooters. The potato weapon shoots fries like a machine gun. The ice cream is a very powerful beam weapon that can also be maneuvered after shooting it to get around tricky corners. Pies reminiscent of clowns are slow to throw but powerful and cause splash damage. And the Jerry, well, jelly beans, but mistranslated due to the lack of an L sound in Japanese, home in on enemies and can fly behind the player at foes like boomerangs, the only power that can hit those behind you. Each weapon has 4 levels obtained by picking up a P icon, shooting more bullets or increasing rates of fire, though in the Gradius fashion, the weapon you hold when you die returns to its base form. Since you can switch at a second's notice, a fun tactic is to have a dump weapon, which you can switch to every time you're about to die to keep your weapons powered up. Also, like many other shooters, there are screen-clearing bombs one can pick up in levels, though the form changes based on what weapon is being used. Jerry encases the player in a bunt gelatin, protecting but also dealing massive damage. Pies turn the screen into a bullet hell for enemies. Ice makes one super strong beam, and I haven't really figured out what Potato does besides making a huge hot yam show up. All of these weapons are great for different situations, further enabled by the ability to switch at a moment's notice to go for more variety in a playthrough. The actual game itself is short enough so that the 4 weapons don't get boring, and hopping in at any time is quite easy, with 6 decently sized levels with their own visual musical themes. You start near the gates of the park with an incredibly whimsical and colorful atmosphere belying the amount of stuff out to kill you. Next you head into the Haunted Mansion, accompanied by a lovely jazzy score, where you fight ghosts, watch a stage play, then fight movie monsters like an incredibly rude Frankenstein. Levels continue showing the inner workings of the park, labs, and enemy factories until you finally face Dr. Tequila. Between each levels are quick animatics featuring voice acting, adding to the personalities of the 2 protagonists, progressing the search for the final foe. The game is approachable, in part due to an easy mode, which even someone as terrible at shooters as me can get to the end using only 1 continue. And even though it's certainly not designed to be the best shooter, the game is obviously having fun with its premise, and lives up to its tagline of highbrow gag and pure shooting. Unfortunately, this would be the last game that developer Sky Think System would make after the puzzle game duology of Kuru-Ren-Pa and Shingata Kuru-Ren-Pa, though the company still exists in some form as software developers. Unfortunately, it seems like the game stood little chance of coming west in its day for a few reasons. Of course, it was developed by a young, small company who would have needed to find an international partner willing to bet on them, and the shoot-'em-up genre was notorious for almost never coming over at the time. More out there 2D shooters were a hard sell to Americans, especially at the time, and ones that weren't space or war themed had even more of an uphill battle, with few like Fantasy Zone and Pocky and Rocky, with that cursed American box art, having some notoriety. Twinbee made it over to PAL but never graced NTSC-EU shelves. Others like KO Flying Squadron and Magical Chase became increasingly niche, yet hilariously expensive to own nowadays. Harmful Park also joins that club, costing way too much money nowadays, like way too many games I've talked about today. At least it's another one even Westerners can grab on the PSN store for $6 while it still exists, and I say it's certainly worth it for the game's presentation alone. There's better shooters than Harmful Park, but very few have as much charm. Much like shoot-'em-ups did to scrolling shooters, there was also a small movement to make fighting games cute in Japan, with a handful of companies in the mid-90s eschewing the fighting streets and the combat of the mortal variety to have pretty girls beat each other up. While not the first of its kind of Bishoujo fighting games, the Asuka 120% series solidified itself as one of the best. Whereas Variable Geo had a tournament of waitresses sponsored by family restaurants, and Pretty Fighter was way too focused on different styles of school uniforms, Asuka tells the story of a school in which a tournament decides funding for its various clubs, with each combatant referencing and even using their activity of choice and fighting style. The Japanese high school setting is common in the country's media, as I'm sure you know from the various anime, dramas, and games, as it appears to capture a mixture of competitive and collaborative environments with some level of freedom, unlike much of the adult crunch culture common in salaried people. There's a reason that high school and growing up is a setting in persona, as it is a time about finding oneself amid an uncaring society of adults with a great amount of structure and freedom in tandem. The relative formalness of clubs and power of the student council, at least compared to its American counterparts, makes for a great division of personnel and power structure in which a tournament, albeit outlandish, slots into place nicely. Asuka's titular character is a first year, Asuka Honda, scouted and trained to represent the chemistry club with the power of martial arts and, in her best Geneva Convention ignoring fashion, various concoctions used to make Hadouken like fireballs. Her self-proclaimed rival is childhood friend Karina Toyota, which names is one way to get across a rivalry, who represents the biology club and trained an incendiary frog to fight alongside her. Other fighters represent various sports, dance, martial art, or are just a girl Ryukin from a rival school. Each character is lively in their voice acting, both in and out of matches, as well as their animations conveying more about their personality, such as the foreigner Kathy Wilde using outlandish grappling moves and setting up a whole ring to fight in, and Karina's hot-headed personality showed by taunting the wrestler in English.
My name is Karina. I'm very, very strong. Are you strong?
In terms of gameplay, Asuka 120% sets itself apart for three main mechanics. The most obvious one is in the title. The 120% refers to a special meter being able to limit break past 100, putting a fighter in a state in which he can use an unlimited amount of specials until the meter drains back to zero. This allows the use of tons of flashy moves in each round as the meter is in a state of rapid ebb and flow. Second is the clash mechanic. Whereas in something like Street Fighter, characters colliding hitboxes at the same time results in both characters getting knocked down, a similar collision here cancels each other out in terms of damage, letting the combatants try and outspeed each other with the next attack in a combo. This encourages a more quick and offensive mode of play than other fighters, whose neutral are typically more defensive. What I would argue is Asuka's best improvement over other fighters isn't the inclusion of the girl fighters, but the simplification of inputs. Most versions of the game only use 3 buttons, light attack, strong attack, and a special attack, and your other moves don't require any extravagant inputs, but only use a forward fireball quarter circle motion, down, down, right, right, a backwards quarter circle, or a double down press, with modifications to that move being made based on what button is pressed along with it to make it either faster or a meter consuming special. And that's it. For every single character, no 360 grapplers, 180 special moves, chart characters, or even DP inputs. Of course, every character has different moves, but they often fit within the same archetype, with the forward quarter circle often being a projectile attack, and a double down being a fast anti-air like a Shoryuken. Despite the inputs being simplified, each character still controls quite uniquely in line with the club she represents, with the martial artist Tarami focusing on heavy close-range attacks, Karina needing to play around her frog companion's position, allowing for more remote attacks or a surprise ground attack while she's in midair, baseball star Kyoko throwing balls and hitting home runs with her bat along a nice aura, and the spunky cheerleader Megami quickly rolls around the arena to get the jump on enemies. The result of the inputs is a game that has a surprisingly low skill floor that almost anyone familiar with fighting games can pick up easily, but has a high ceiling due to the clash mechanic, a focus on speed and mobility, and heightened aerial combat. I'm no fighting game scientist, but I always have a ton of fun trying out each character and getting through arcade mode quickly. The first Asuka game to hit PlayStation was Asuka 120% Burning Fest Special, which for all intents and purposes is the full package when it comes to a console fighting game. Note, however, that the version I'm talking about here is technically the game's revision, noted on the box art by a period after special, which has some tweaks that I don't quite understand enough to talk about, but this is a version on the PS3 store and used commonly in competitions. Present here is an arcade mode, which features your chosen character fighting through the other 7 characters to win funds for their club. Dialogue exists between rounds, not that I can read or understand it, but it is a quick overall experience to go through for a couple rounds. The difficulty in game speed can be adjusted in the settings, as well as saving your score, and beating the arcade mode on normal or above with no continues will have you fight the secret character from a rival school, Shinobu, and unlock her. The graphics are pretty faithful to the original home PC releases and are not especially detailed for a PlayStation game, but retains the charm of slightly deformed characters that facilitate fair and understandable hit and hurt boxes, in addition to allowing the game to move at a great speed. Music is fantastic too, adding more to the frenetic pace and energy, though songs are short and often need to loop if a match lasts too long. Voice acting is present both in battles and between bouts in the arcade mode, and is commendable for adding to the chaotic nature of battling teenagers without being overly obnoxious. Also present is, of course, a versus mode, allowing friends, foes, or rivals to duke it out IRL, and allow this release to apparently be the competitive Asuka version used in the Japanese scene, according to this site. Between the great balance, fantastic mechanics, and overall snappiness, it's no wonder why. The next game's actually a remake, with Asuka 120% Burning Fest Excellent actually being a retooling of an earlier PC game of the same name. That doesn't mean it's any less though, as the fights are actually virtually identical to Special, and as far as I can tell, are using the same engine without really many changes. The main new addition here, besides an appreciated training mode, is an enhanced story mode replacing the arcade mode of Special. The single-player mode here, taken from the game this is a remake of, is a single-player adventure game similar to what many Americans like me would call visual novels. Here you have much greater amounts of dialogue to experience than Special, both with combatants and with others, with a far better presentation than the arcade mode quips found previously. The player then follows their chosen character through the sim to fight for their club's future. Between rounds, you not only learned a more fleshed out story, but select places to go within the school, things to buy, and activities to do to increase stats in battle, even at some point unlocking the titular 120% special meter, which is not present at the beginning. Unfortunately, text is all in Japanese, except what Kathy is speaking out loud, and I don't know the language well enough, so navigating text-based menus is incredibly hard. As a result, to someone who doesn't read or speak Japanese, I'd easily recommend Special over Excellent just for its more navigable single-player mode, even if I have so much respect for, and honestly a desire to play, Excellent story mode, of which there is a ton. After Excellent, the series made a quick move over to the Saturn, the platform which arguably was superior for 2D gaming, especially within the fighting game scene, with Burning Fest Limited. Limited revamps the engine with a new art style while retaining the excellent fighting of the previous games for a flashy and brighter experience, and adds both Asuka's senpai and the school president to the roster. Unfortunately, it seems this was too little too late in the end, as wonderful as the game is, and Villain Cafe would go out of business soon after. Some devs would then release a revision of Limited soon after, known as Limit Over, which is currently, after a fan translation patch, widely considered the game in the series to play competitively, at least in the West. And although it's not a PlayStation game and thus breaks the theme of the video, it is a game that comes with my highest recommendation. Emulators that support netplay like Mednafen make playing this game a huge joy competitively or casually, in addition to being documented quite well in fan wikis. While Villain Cafe was done, Asuka, for better or worse, wasn't, with Burning Fest Final coming out soon after on the PlayStation, bringing much of the improved graphics back with it, as well as a great new character in the announcer, and it looks really good, but I'm sorry, I really just don't like this game. Success, who I in general have a lot of admiration for, took over development duties and couldn't leave good enough alone by adding one crucial change, a stamina gauge. Instead of having the one health bar, each fighter has the other gauge as well, and hits bring both of these meters down, but stamina recovers somewhat over time. Either of these meters being depleted ends a match in the other character's favor, but in my experience it was so rare I ever saw this happen. Maybe I'm just really bad, but most matches of this game I played ended in a timeout, with the victor's health gauge being the one that was more full. To me, this just ruins the kinetic looseness and snappiness of the previous games, with matches feeling more defensive and all around just slower as a result. And unfortunately, this just ruins the rest of the game for me, which otherwise excels with its wonderful graphics and music. It seems I wasn't quite alone in this judgment, as despite getting some decent reviews, Final was soon relegated to the bargain bin, becoming part of the super light 1500 series and only costing 1500 yen. One final game was made by Success, a Windows game subtitled Return, coming back to home PCs after half a decade focused on home consoles, but after that, nothing. Until whispers in the past few years of a revival by Opera House, and we'll see what comes of that. Despite everything, I adore Asuka 120%, and I think every fighting game fan, especially those who like anime fighters, should at the very least try Limit Over, or if you prefer PlayStation games, Special, for a wonderful time. Unfortunately, I've dedicated myself to evangelizing the series and knowing those in discords I frequent, because I want everyone to try out this approachable yet complex fighting game. Though none of the Asuka games made it overseas officially, their influence in games that did is quite apparent. Most anime fighters especially take influence from the neutral game here, with series like Guilty Gear taking cues both from the amount of movement presence and the increased aerial mobility. The setting and excellent story mode, while not wholly original to this game or a direct adaptation of something else, was a clear influence on visual novel turned fighting game spin-offs like Queen of Hearts 98's and Multi-Blood, made by the later christened Soft Circle French Bread, who followed a similar route to Filling Cafe of a doujin scene to full company, albeit with quite a bit more success. And as the years following the fighting game and arcade boom and bust have passed, many developers have tried making fighting games more accessible for a larger audience without completely leveling the playing field or breaking the competitive game, with very variable success. Though what for my money's worth feels most like a tonal successor in this front might actually be the modern controls in Street Fighter VI, which excel in making a diverse cast easier to understand at a glance by focusing on a consistent archetype of moves mapped to a single special button. However, before their unfortunate collapse, Filling Cafe did make some fantastic non-fighting games in addition to the Asuka series. Here on the Japanese PlayStation, they put out a remake of their own X68000 game, Mad Stalker Full Metal Force. Despite 3D backgrounds, the game and its characters are largely 2D sprites with a kinetic mech-based beat-em-up. The same engine and a similar look was used for a new title too, Panzer Bandit, which replicated the action of Mad Stalker in a bright, more anime-like setting, featuring multiple playable characters. Both titles use a fighting game-like input system to pull off special moves, borrowing in simplicity from Asuka, and overall allow a more varied and deeper approach to combat than many of its contemporaries. Extra helpful given that many franchises of the like took a back seat in the 3D era. Instead, these 2.5D-ish wonders show another path that maybe more should have been taken in moving the genre forward. Regardless, both games are certainly worth playing, and unfortunately, a sequel to Panzer Bandit was cancelled when the company shuttered too. While it is unfortunate that these games never made it westward, the exception being Rapid Reload coming to Europe of course, in the end it is somewhat understandable. The PlayStation as a platform, and that generation as a whole, was a time of both rapid development in technology and game design, in addition to being an era of quick expansion and contraction. On one hand, 3D was a huge hotness, arguably more in America and Europe than in Japan based on what developers were making. And while the games I mentioned here are great, they are ultimately based in design principles from a previous era. Your Resident Evil or Air Combat is much more forward-thinking and conceptually new, at least from a console game standpoint, than a Little Ralph rooted in side-scrolling platformers, or another Street Fighter 2-esque fighter like Asuka, even if the latter would generally be considered to be more playable. It makes sense when even looking towards Nintendo, as Star Fox 2 was cancelled at near completion because of how primitive Super FX powered polygonal graphics look compared to the PlayStation's Ridge Racer or Saturn's Daytona USA. And that jump is apparent there, while not nearly as much while looking at the system's 2D offerings. Gaia Seed simply doesn't look that much better than Yoshi's Island, not enough to buy a new $289 console at least. One thing often forgotten today about viewing 3D graphics on a CRT or even just a smaller display is that many jaggies or flickery textures that we complain about now just weren't as visible. This is true for 2D games too. Just look at how Dracula's Eyes and Symphony of the Night had just one little pixel of red because it expected a CRT would bleed it to the neighboring pixels. But even blocky pixel graphics are often forgiven, likely due to widespread emulation in indie pixel games making the style as displayed on a flat screen an actual aesthetic. And for 3D, the PS1 just ended up being a great place to exist. The Saturn, despite being more powerful on paper, was not as easy to work with, and its poor performance in the West made it less desirable to shift resources for. So games like Tomb Raider often suffered slowdown when compared to the PlayStation counterpart. On the other hand, the Saturn's brute power, Sega and arcade backing, success in Japan, and expandable RAM made it home for what was often superior versions of 2D and fighting games, like much of Capcom's work. And in comparison to the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation was far more lucrative to make games for due to a much larger install base, an extended storage capacity thanks to the CDs, and not having to compete with Nintendo's own games on the same platform. Thus, many games that may have made the Nintendo 64 look like the 3D powerhouse it actually was likely stayed on other platforms. As a result, the PlayStation became home to many great 3D games that may have made the 2D look like the past. These decisions on the PlayStation may be controversial, with people online still blaming Bernie Stolar and his death for their favorite game not making it west. But his work in courting developers to make 3D sales powerhouses for the console such as Ridge Racer and Crash Bandicoot paid dividends in how successful they were in selling both themselves and the PlayStation as a brand that lasts to this day in many ways, and far outsold its competitors. In the end, the relatively 3D heavy PlayStation beat the 2D powerhouse of the Saturn, obviously for a variety of reasons, but games can often sell a system. Though one of the common threads between nearly every game here is that they were developed by smaller or relative startup companies. The PlayStation represented something of a boom period for the Japanese home console gaming industry, part of a national economy still reeling in many ways from the fallout of the bursting of the bubble era earlier in the decade. Many Japanese home computer lines were rapidly falling by the wayside by the mid-90s in favor of Windows, so some visual novels and RPGs that originally had their home on the computer moved to the next big thing in the home console business, the PlayStation. CDs were much cheaper to produce than cartridges in general, and could hold much more space, so there was far less risk in terms of manufacturing costs for making a PlayStation or Saturn game than a Super Nintendo game, to the point that by the end of the PlayStation's life cycle there is a flux of budget game lines such as the Simple series, often selling games for 1,500 yen instead of the 5,000 plus of most others. As this was happening, many genres that hadn't quite taken off in the West were seeing newfound popularity, namely Final Fantasy VII and JRPGs, showing that previously more niche genres or games that were considered too Japanese could be a success even in the West. This new market opening, along with the PlayStation's unprecedented sales and opportunities a burgeoning internet provides, made many companies existing in the software space, teams consisting of former employees from established developers, and doujin groups that incorporated to sell their works, look towards making games for the PlayStation to get a little piece of that pie. Publishing a passion project in your home country is one thing, but getting that project distributed abroad is another that these companies couldn't afford without someone taking a huge risk to offset localization costs and gambling on sales. An exciting 3D game might be worth Sony Computer Entertainment of America's time, but 2D games were just not seen as that impressive as the new hotness, which seems a likely reason why Sony of Europe and Japan published Rapid Reload / Gunner's Heaven, but Sony of America didn't. Of course, Konami, Namco, and even Ubisoft could front the cost to make Castlevania, Klonoa, and Rayman available on the American PlayStation, but FamilySoft and Sky System Think likely could not, considering how many of these companies went belly up or retreated to the computer software market. It's a shame, of course, that we never saw Ralph or Asuka made available popularly here, but money makes fools of us all. What we can do nowadays is be thankful that PlayStation games are more accessible than ever, and new fan translations pop up nearly every day. The companies may not have all survived, but these games did, and their presentation, gameplay, music, and much more is forever, no matter what Bernie Stolar's alleged policy was in the end. All of these games are great and worth checking out even if they didn't officially come out here except for on the PlayStation 3 Digital Store in some cases, but there are many archives and other opportunities to play these games today.
眩しく響く